in just one moment, but I will wait for a few more people to join from the waiting room, and I will give a brief update onto where we are. So this is our final Arctic Spring College Geopolitics Intensive session officially, but now transitions into more of our discussion sessions and our working groups. I will be uploading a short video later today with some additional information about what comes next, what to expect for the briefers, and how we will continue to foster a network between you, but also between other Arctic College participants from the winter session and from the next Arctic Spring College session that is more humanities focused. Our intent here is for you to make lasting connections beyond these 5 weeks, and we're going to do a lot of that work after today. So don't think that this is your final time hearing from me or being on a Zoom call. I am sorry to say you can't get rid of me that easily. So we will be following up with ways to stay connected to one another and also to uplift your own opinions, commentaries, research through those briefers, but also through public webinars, podcasts, and other opportunities to make sure that you get the support you need to go from an early career scholar, practitioner, leader into someone who is known in the Arctic space. So with that, I am going to stop talking and introduce our first speaker, Rebecca Lunga, who thank you so much for joining us today. Rebecca is a policy advisor at the United Nations, and she focuses on human rights, Indigenous peoples issues, and overall kind of the fight against torture, civic spaces, protection of human rights. She'll be talking today about the United Nations as a mechanism for Indigenous rights, for human rights, and also about negotiations and what it looks like within an international organization rather than some of the more country-specific presentations we have heard in past weeks. I am going to hand my virtual mic over to Rebecca and spotlight her. But as a reminder, if you have questions for Rebecca throughout her presentation, please type them in the chat box and we will be having a robust discussion after her presentation. So I will be monitoring that as Rebecca is talking. I'll hand my virtual mic over to you and maybe introduce yourself a bit more and then we can jump into it.
Sounds good. Thank you. And I can see my video's lagging. If it gets too annoying, I'll turn it off. But just for you to see me in the beginning at least. Hello, everyone. Greetings from New York. I'm just to give you a little bit background, I'm from Greenland and have been here in New York since just before COVID started. So not the most fun time to be in New York. Before that, I was in DC, in Washington, DC, at the Greenland representation there. We have 4 representations abroad working on bilateral relations with partners. And so I was in DC for 3 years working on issues of common interest between Greenland and the US at a federal level, but also working with states that are obviously of particular interest to us. A lot of ties to Alaska for obvious reasons, but also a state like Maine who has shipping possibilities and trade possibilities with Greenland. So before that, I was at the Department of Foreign Affairs at the government of Greenland in Nuuk. I come from a long family of Greenlanders, of Inuit on my mother's side and a Danish father. So that is a bit on my background. So I've been with the government of Greenland for about 5 years or so, and I'm on leave now to be here at the permanent mission of Denmark to the United Nations. And as Victoria said, I sit with human rights and specifically with indigenous issues. And right now, actually, we have the permanent forum on indigenous issues going on. It happens every year. It's one of the 3 indigenous specific mechanisms under the UN. And I will talk a bit more about that later in my presentation. And so I will talk on the UN, but firstly, I thought I'd just give a little bit of Greenland background. I don't know to what extent Inuit covered it, but before I talk on indigenous issues at a global level and at the UN level, from a multilateral perspective, obviously this being a conversation on the Arctic, I wanted to talk a little bit about indigenous knowledge and indigenous in the Greenland context and that background. So I'm going to share my screen with you. If I can. Let's see. Yeah, working? Okay, I see thumbs up. So here. All right, so I hope you can all see this not so accurate photo from Greenland. This obviously is a meme that came about when the former U.S. administration offered to buy Greenland, and when it happened, I thought it was interesting to start with because it sort of can let me loop into how the Danish-Greenlandic relationship has developed over time. Because when this happened, it started a little bit of a diplomatic crisis almost between countries and between Denmark and the US, where the former president of the US got offended by the Danish prime minister's reaction to this offer to buy Greenland. But what she said, the Danish prime minister, was, even if it was something that was on the table, it was not for Denmark to give or to sell. It was not for Denmark to decide. I think she even said, Greenland belongs to the Greenlanders, it belongs to Greenland. And that sort of illustrates how far we have come in the relations between Greenland and Denmark, because the relationship, the historical relationship between Greenland and Denmark is a complex one. And 2021 is actually a special year. 300 years have passed since the Norwegian-Danish priest Hans Egede arrived in West Greenland in what we call Kalaallit Nunaat, previously known as Inuit Nunaat, because obviously it predecesses Greenland. And he arrived in 1721, so it's been 300 years. And just to give a little bit of more background, Greenland is the largest island in the world. It is a very large territory. I remember when I was in DC, we used to illustrate it. Now I forget the states, but it is a vast. It's larger than Alaska. It's most of the West Coast put together with Alaska. If you have to put the territory on top of the U.S. But with that, it's only just under 57,000 people on this large territory. So we have the lowest population density in the world. We're scattered in towns and settlements along the coastline, with most living on the southern west coast. 81% is covered by ice. I think most people know this because Greenland obviously is one of the potential big sinners that we're seeing. It will be the cost of our waters rising, of the oceans rising, because the Greenland ice cap is melting, amongst others. So the majority of the population derived from Greenland, from Inuit, and we are related to Inuit in Alaska and Canada. The Greenland Inuit refer to ourselves Kalaallit, which means Greenlanders, and the majority speak Kalaallisut, which is the official language in Greenland now, that changed with developments of autonomy. So now the second language is Danish, and the official language is Greenlandic. And Danish always being part of the colonial past, and the reason why we still have that today. I wanted to show you a map here. This shows you, some of you may know this already, but this shows the territory of Inuit Nunaat, which encompasses the Russian Far East, Arctic Alaska, Arctic Canada, and Greenland, Galatlit Nunaat as well. And this is where Inuit derive and have ties. It's a distinct geographical and cultural and political region that includes major marine areas, inland waters, Arctic and offshore areas, as well as ice-covered lands and waters. But so with colonization in 1721, Inuit and Galatlit Nunaat were introduced to the Western worldview and ways of life. But after the United Nations was founded, countries were asked to start a decolonization process, and that's sort of what spurred the development for Greenland. And with that, in 1953, Greenland became a Danish constituency. Actually, my great-grandfather was a Greenlandic politician, and he came with the Danish delegation to Geneva, to the United Nations, to inform of this formal process being started of Greenland becoming a constituency, a part of Denmark, and not a colony anymore. However, there was a continued push for greater autonomy throughout the 50s and 60s with assimilation policies in Greenland. And that came to be a political movement, really, that we saw in the early 70s. There was this great Greenlandic rock band called Sume, who made all these political songs, and it's said to spur a political movement. And I'll recommend it. It's actually a documentary now that you can find, and I can share that also with Victoria if anyone would have interest in seeing that. It really depicts what happened in the 70s, which led to the adoption of the Home Rule Act in 79. And with that, Government of Greenland, Naalakkersuisut, was formed, and the Parliament of Greenland, Inatsisartut, as well. So consequently, Greenland became a self-governing part of the Danish realm in 1979, and in 2009 entered into a new era with self-government, which gave Greenland further self-determination and also a way for independence in the future, if that is what the Greenlandic people decides. There is the act stipulates that through a referendum, the Greenlandic people can decide to become independent in the future. So with that in mind, the Government of Greenland's purpose is very much to achieve a sustainable economy, to achieve greater independence in the future. But that sort of, oh yeah, I have a bunch of text on this. I can share it with Victoria if it's of interest. But I just wanted to go back to this slide because it sort of puts us back to the offer of buying Greenland. When it came about, it was back home. Obviously, I was in DC, but followed the news and talked with friends and family back home, and people sort of very much laughed it off. I could see the humor in it and shared these memes and thought it was silly. But it also tapped into sort of a sensitivity, I would say, that is derived from the colonial past and recent memory of not being part of decision-making processes. Not being seated at the table, but decisions being made in the capital, far away, not in the Arctic. So it's about, inclusivity and the path and the development that Greenland has seen. There's still sensitivities there, and there's still a wish for greater autonomy. With that being said, Greenland is still one of the best practice we see when it comes to indigenous peoples all over the world, in terms of the level of autonomy and the respect for Greenlanders, Inuit as a distinct people. So it's just you know, to make that point of inclusion. What we see in the Arctic is very much, when I was in DC as well, we hosted some events on the need to bring discussions on the Arctic to the Arctic. You know, it's we had events in DC on it, and we tried to get people from back home, researchers and scientists and local knowledge holders to come to DC and be a part of the conversations, because what we still see to a very large degree is that the, you know, discussions and decision making on what will happen in the Arctic doesn't necessarily take place in the Arctic, and the people who should be at, you know, it's their table, who should be at that table, are not necessarily there. So as you may have sensed by now, the theme that I'm talking about when it comes to Indigenous peoples that is relevant not only in the Arctic, but at a global level all over the world, especially in a lot of other regions as well, is the issue of access. Obviously, and as a minimum when it comes to decisions in our territories, but also at the global level. So despite cultural differences, Indigenous peoples from all over the world share common issues related to the protection of their rights as distinct peoples. And so I think this would kind of let me zoom out a little bit and talk more at the international level and from a UN perspective on this. And I will stop sharing my screen for you guys, I think. Is it working?
We can't see your video, but you have stopped sharing your screen.
All right, let me just get my video back on once I find you guys. Sorry, I'm not a technical wizard. Even though I've been at so many Zoom calls by now, it's not my forte. Okay, there we go. So okay, if we talk at an global level on Indigenous peoples, just in the Arctic, it's 400,000 Indigenous peoples. At the global level, we're talking about almost 500 million people, who are arguably the most disadvantaged and vulnerable groups in the world still today, and in many places not acknowledged even as being Indigenous. And at the challenges that Indigenous peoples face, be it right now with the current COVID-19 pandemic or the impacts of climate change, they're exacerbated by the fact that Indigenous peoples, their rights and their institutions lack this recognition, bearing them from being for participating in decision making. So at the international level, Indigenous peoples have worked for decades to gain recognition of their rights. Now, to a certain extent, the international community recognizes that special measures are required to protect Indigenous rights and maintain their distinct cultures and way of life. And there are some key instruments and mechanisms at the UN level that I just want to highlight to you guys on this. The document that we refer to and that is used to try to uphold Indigenous rights in regional and in local national contexts is the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It was adopted by the General Assembly in 2007, and it's the most comprehensive statement of the rights of Indigenous peoples ever developed, giving prominence to collective rights to a degree unprecedented in international human rights law. And it is so it's sort of the clearest indication yet that the international community is committing itself to the protection of not just the individual human rights, but the collective rights of Indigenous peoples. And the declaration, it was a culmination of over 20 years of work that began in the 90s and with the Commission on the Human Rights. And more than 100 Indigenous organizations participated in a working group to develop this document. So the adoption of the declaration in 2007 was a really important milestone at the international level to advance the rights and aspirations of Indigenous peoples. But sadly, as we're seeing only highlighted during COVID and in the past year, human rights violations continue. It continuously happens to Indigenous peoples, and it illustrates the gap we have between realizing the rights of Indigenous peoples and the UNDRIP, as we set out to with that document. So, in spite of the Declaration's establishment of Indigenous peoples to be included on issues affecting them, inter alia access to decision making remains an issue, and Indigenous peoples across the world continue to experience the consequences of historical colonization and invasion of their territories. They face discrimination globally because of distinct cultures, identities, and way of life, and are disproportionately affected by poverty and marginalization. So to deal with this, besides the declaration at the UN level, there are mainly 3 mechanisms put in place to deal with Indigenous issues, and their avenues for Indigenous peoples to engage with the UN and raise awareness of their situations in local contexts as well, and the challenges they face with their governments. So we have, one of them is the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which was set up in 2001. And the mandate is given to an individual, an expert who sits as a special rapporteur for a period of time, and the special rapporteur will go on country visits, will try to get invited by governments. You can also request the special rapporteur to come to your territory or come to the country and investigate, and they will do a report that they will present to the Human Rights Council in Geneva on the situation of Indigenous peoples in the specific country. That's one of the things they do. They also address this, or the Special Rapporteur also addresses specific cases of violations of Indigenous peoples' rights. And on the website, it's possible for Indigenous peoples themselves to file complaints, or if there are issues that they would like the Special Rapporteur to look into. Then there's the expert mechanism on the rights of Indigenous peoples. This was established by the Human Rights Council, which is the UN's main human rights body, and it is in Geneva and not here in New York. And the MRIP, which we call it an abbreviation, was established in 2007. And it provides the Human Rights Council with expertise and advice on the rights of Indigenous peoples, and it's meant to assist member states in achieving the goals as set out in the UNDRIP, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The MRIP, they conduct studies as well to advance the promotion and protections of Indigenous peoples and their rights. And they suggest measures that states and others can adopt within laws, policies, and programs to help advance what was set out in the UNDRIP and the Declaration. And it is also possible for the MRIP to provide input into their studies that they undertake on their website when they start out with looking into a topic. They will call on Indigenous peoples, states, but also national human rights institutions and academics to provide contributions to their studies. So this is something that can be fed into their process. Right now, they were just conducting a study on the rights of the Indigenous child. And I think that call was just closed, but it was open for a period of time for academics, Indigenous peoples, states, NGOs, et cetera, to provide input from their experiences to this study. Then lastly, we have the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, which takes place here in New York, and which, as I said in the beginning, we have right now. We have 2 weeks of the Permanent Forum. Sadly, obviously, because of COVID, we don't have it in person. which is a shame because it is a possibility for Indigenous representatives to come to New York, to come to the halls of the UN, to meet with member states and UN entities in person and talk on their issues. So right now everything is virtual, and that of course has its barriers for participation. Also, as many don't have necessarily have access to internet and are not able to participate because of it. But the UNPFII, as it's abbreviated to, was established in 2000, and it deals with Indigenous issues related to economic and social development, culture, environment, education, health, and human rights. And the Permanent Forum is comprised of Indigenous peoples representatives and member states representatives, so an equal amount of those. And right now, the Kingdom of Denmark has a representative a member in the forum, who is from Greenland, actually. So sort of an Indigenous representative and a member state representative all combined, which is rare that you see that, but it's good to see, and we need to see more of it. Let me see, I talked for quite a bit. I wanted to just quickly touch upon, besides these three mechanisms that are the overarching ones for Indigenous issues at the UN level, and the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which is the main document that we seek to implement. Obviously, there are also different processes and instruments where we start to see Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous peoples represented a bit more. Obviously, it's going too slow, in my opinion, but at least on the climate issues and climate policies, there has been some developments in recent years to include Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous representatives in the design and hopefully implementation of climate policies. So when we look at the 700 or the 476 million Indigenous peoples in the world, they comprise 6.2% of the global population. But that 6.2% of the global population they safeguard around 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity. So obviously there is a massive need to include Indigenous peoples, not only when it comes to their territories and what goes on in their territories where they should have a say, but also beyond that, also when we look at nature-based solutions for climate action, to tap into the Indigenous knowledge and what has been learned through millennia, is something that the global community is starting to opening their eyes to. So we hosted yesterday in the margin of the Permanent Forum, the mission here, myself, together with Greenland and the NGO IWGIA, which is the International Working Group on Indigenous Affairs. We hosted an event on Indigenous people's key role in climate action. And we had Indigenous representatives from the Arctic, but also from Africa and Asia, together with UNESCO and IWGIA, to talk about how Indigenous peoples would like to be included in the formulation of climate policies, what is needed and what is lacking. And what we saw is that there has been, when we talk about the Paris Agreement, for instance, the rights of Indigenous peoples are specifically recognized here, several places in the Paris Agreement. Most importantly is a platform that was established under the Paris Agreement, and it's called Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples Platform. And this platform is for the exchange of experiences and sharing of best practices on mitigation and adaptation. And the idea is that that is in a holistic and integrated manner. And we had on the panel yesterday, who you may have heard of before, I'm sure you have, hopefully, the chair of ICC Inuit Circumpolar Council, Dr. Daly Samboduro, who's also right now, she's the member of a facilitative working group under this platform where she represents the Arctic for Indigenous peoples. And she explained a bit about what is interesting about this platform, and what we are seeing is that this is a place where Indigenous peoples are represented at an equal level as member states. And there's equity in the way that they draft their work plan and the input that Indigenous peoples come with. So there are some developments with that. We are also seeing under the Arctic High Seas Fisheries Agreement that was concluded a couple of years ago between the Arctic 5 and 5 other states, including South Korea, China, Japan, the European Union. There was also going to be established a working group. I forget if that's the correct term. It's been a couple of years, but there was established a group to look into scientific cooperation and the co-production of knowledge between scientific investigation into the Arctic Ocean and the Arctic high seas, and Indigenous knowledge on the issue. So I think all this to sum up briefly, just to say that, as we look towards here in the UN right now, all the member states are talking about how we look beyond the pandemic and how we rebuild our societies. We build back better and greener and more just. And I think, for that, we need to look into the inclusion of Indigenous peoples, a meaningful inclusion, not just on paper, as we're getting their words on paper, but we need to see it implemented. And when it comes to climate action, the inclusion of Indigenous peoples' nature-based solutions and practices for biodiversity conservation and climate change adaptation and mitigation policies, we have seen how it works, and Indigenous peoples are part of the solution, and they need to be treated as such. Member states are coming to realize this. Some are, at least. There's still a long way to go, but hopefully it will come around, because it's the smart thing to do, not just because it's the right thing to do, and because Indigenous peoples deserve every bit of rights as the individual does, but also because it's vital if we're gonna sustain our planet and have a future. So I think maybe I'll just stop there, and we can have a dialogue and a discussion based off of that. I hope I didn't overlap with what you've already been told in previous sessions.
No, that was fantastic. Before we go into our question and answer, I just want to ask everyone to join me in a huge virtual round of applause, because that was a really great overview. And I think understanding both the local and global picture and also connections and where we should be going is really informative for what comes next for this group, as we think about how each of our fellows can best engage and inform in future policy around the Arctic. So thank you for that. We have many questions that have come in. I'm going to ask Dave if you would like to come on first and ask your question.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for that discussion. I think the overview and the experience that you bring to the table on this is really fantastic. My background, I'm in Colorado, so I'm sad that you're not having the best experience in New York, and I hope that improves here pretty soon. One of the things that I've been working on through work is the Thule Investment Project and how to develop the Thule Air Base. So not only have we been looking at, runways and hangars and stuff like that, one of the biggest problems that we're trying to solve up there is the communications problem and the long range, long haul communications. I know that in the news lately, there's potentially this spring is going to be the start of laying of the Transarctic fiber optic cable. And we've kind of been looking at that project and looking at, do we need to do some kind of an undersea cable system? do we need to be incorporating space-based systems, long-range microwave repeater arrays, and things like that, and just trying to figure out how are we going to deliver information all across up into the Arctic where we need it. I also lived for a while in Alaska, and I know that getting information out to a lot of those smaller communities, especially in northern Alaska, and a lot of the indigenous people up into the high latitudes, is a real problem set for them. Working at the UN, obviously the UN is really the heart of the world in terms of defining what human rights are, and how do we really get after human rights. And I think a lot of the times we look back on legacy of human rights, like access to housing, access to clean drinking water and healthcare and stuff like that. But now, as you brought up, COVID has really highlighted a lot of the disparities between indigenous and developed communities, in particular with regard to self-government or governance and participation in governance, because now we have to do it by virtual platforms, right? And a lot of those people are being left out. So really, I just want to kind of boil it down, and this comes into some of the questions that some of the folks in my working group have had. But I just want to know what your perspective is, and what is the perspective of the UN on access to information as a basic human right. In Article 14 of the UN Declaration that you kind of pointed us into the direction of, in there it talks about students having access to all levels and forms of education, but if they're in isolated communities, how do we do that if they don't have access to that information? So just over to you for some perspective on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Should I go ahead, Victoria? Or do you want to get a few in and then I can answer together?
You could answer this one first. I'll pull up them as we go.
Okay, sounds good. Well, thank you so much, and greetings to Colorado. I've been there and it's beautiful. It reminds me a little bit more of home than New York does, I have to say. So interesting that you're working on the Thule Investment Project, and definitely agree. I don't have a lot of expertise when it comes specifically to the communications issue, like how to go about that. But I hope that we will succeed in getting something, that works better for the northern part of Greenland. So great that you guys are active on it. Definitely when it comes to COVID-19, you can't say something good about the pandemic, and it has been terrible for many indigenous communities, particularly all over the world. In Greenland, we've been very fortunate. This is obviously due to the fact that it's an island and they've managed to close off. So Greenland is one of the few territories today that doesn't have COVID at all. And they're still on lockdown and not allowing international travel to keep it out, which I think obviously what we're seeing in other parts of the world in indigenous communities that are isolated, you would not want that to happen and to come. But especially COVID-19 has shown, and the discussions here at the UN have obviously been on how it illustrates that indigenous peoples are not taken into account, or they're not included in developing the response. So the responses to COVID-19, the policies that have been put in place by states have not included indigenous peoples. So they have not been, either we have seen outsiders come into the territories and actually by accident, when they try to help them during COVID, they have brought COVID with them into the communities. It has not been, adequate in terms of their practices. So specific indigenous practices, which vary from community to community, that they have not been respectful of that. And then the information issue, as you also mentioned, that it has not been made available to them in indigenous languages. So a lot of indigenous communities have not been informed appropriately on COVID-19, the severity of it, or the policies in place, what needs to be done. So these things have not been communicated in proper ways. And it really goes to show, as you also said, it leads back to the right to information, and how do we get these, how do we make sure that Indigenous people's rights are heard and are taken into account? And this is sadly a problem in many areas, not just the Arctic, but all over the world. And COVID has really illustrated this. And I think it has brought, like I said in the beginning, not to say anything positive about it, but it has brought the issue of Indigenous peoples and the marginalization that they're experiencing to on the agenda at the United Nations, and it has brought awareness, and also made some member states who don't have an interest in discussing it, they can't flee from it, and we've had those discussions, and we have them continuously on how this needs to be addressed, because it has been dramatic to see the disparities when you look at Indigenous peoples and regular parts of populations.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's, equal parts devastating, frustrating, and, to your point, somewhat encouraging that I think these really have brought it to the forefront. And I think, I have seen that as a observer and someone who is engaged as a researcher. So that's, at least there is that next step that you can continue to push further. Samuel, I'm going to ask you to come and ask your question next.
Yeah, thank you for a really great talk. I was just wondering what would be your thoughts on a UN-led initiative regarding climate change and Arctic sustainability to sort of recreate a REDD+ style framework the UN uses currently for forest sustainability in the Arctic, working with the Arctic's Indigenous peoples as environmental stewards rather than sort of relying on Arctic development being economically driven by sort of extractive industries.
Thank you, Samuel. I think that's a great idea. I think we should do that. In general, I would say at the UN, I was surprised. Obviously, the UN is all about what we do as the international community. But that being said, the Arctic region is not on the agenda at all at the UN. And it is interesting to see, and definitely something I'm trying to highlight and make the mission here aware of. But it's there are some obvious opportunities, and Arctic sustainability not only benefits the Arctic, right? As you know, it's the entire planet. So it taps into climate, which is a big part of the agenda at the UN. And climate action, we had the Arctic, or not the Arctic, the climate summit just last year with the UN Secretary General. And it's interesting when it's such a high priority, and obviously there's so much awareness that the Arctic is not part of the discussion. So yes, want to hear more on that.
All right, well, I hear a future collaboration or topic for a briefer, or maybe even a grant to further explore what that proposal looks like. So definitely some next steps coming here. Jeffrey, would you like to come on and ask your question next?
Yes, thank you. Thanks a lot, Rebecca. That was a really great presentation, and I particularly enjoyed how you spoke about your family a bit. It was interesting to hear about your great-grandfather. One part of your presentation that stood out to me was you mentioned the importance of bringing discussions on the Arctic to the Arctic. And I agree with this as well. Now, in our context, considering that the Arctic Spring College fellows are majority living in the South, I wondered if you could share any thoughts or advice maybe that you had for us as we do our work, because our positionality as Southerners, it's a topic that I'd be interested to hear your thoughts about. Specifically, how can people like ourselves position as allies, and how can we promote equity? And that's a really big question, and it's one that I struggle with a lot. I'm calling from Southern Ontario, Saugeen Ojibwe territory, and I'm a master's student interested in Indigenous knowledge, equity, and yeah, as somebody who has that perspective, I think you might have some helpful answers for me.
Thank you. I appreciate that question. And I think, you know, the mindset is exactly the mindset we need, right? It's you illustrate an awareness of what you set out to do, and that has to be in collaboration and in participation and discussion with the peoples of that region, or of, in this case, in the Arctic, right? So obviously, when I said that we really want to see discussions to be brought to the region, that was a thing we were working on when I was in DC, and I'm sure they still are, is, you know, to have more of these conversations take place in the region. But that also means, you know, creating the opportunities for that. So, you know, for you guys to come up to conferences that are held in the Arctic, even though it's hard to get there and it's expensive. So we have to gather more funds for that. But having these opportunities for people like you who are interested to actually come to the region and be a part of the discussions there too is something that I think is really important. And it's slowly developing, but obviously it takes time and funds. But that being said, there are also other ways to go about it, and conversations, even though not ideal, but virtually like this also gets us part of the way. One of the things we worked on when I was at the representation in DC, we had a collaboration with the National Science Foundation on researchers specifically. So when we talk of, you know, each year just in Greenland, we have hundreds of researchers that come to Greenland to study climate change and go to the ice cap. And we kind of call them hit and run researchers, because they just go in, they do their research, and they leave. So we had collaboration, and they're still working on ways in which we make sure that researchers that come to Greenland, that they're also allowed time to engage with the community and leave some knowledge behind, educate the local communities on what it is they're doing. And with that, they will also get knowledge in return on what the local communities are seeing, and is exactly the Indigenous knowledge that we were talking about. So I think those efforts that are being undertaken is also really important. And obviously it also falls back on grants, right? Because I realize that when researchers apply for grants, it doesn't allow the time, essentially, or the money, the funds for them to stay and do these things. So some, you know, working on mechanisms in which we can have that in place, so it's part of what they get. So it is really a lot about collaborative efforts to ensure these things. And from Greenland, I can say that I know that they're working on establishing an Arctic research hub in Greenland, which would also be a big step that would allow researchers to come and spend time in Greenland at the research hub, and also work with Indigenous and local researchers and scientists, as well as local communities. I'll stop there. Sorry, it was long.
No, that was a great answer. Thank you so much. And also is a little bit of a plug for some fall workshops we are working on for Arctic College participants on research ethics and cooperation and collaboration. And one of those is specifically about that idea of what I think some researchers call the mosquito research model, where you go in and extract and leave. So look for that email in your inbox in a month for some options to dig deeper into those issues. We have a few more questions before we finish out our first session here. Sigrid would like to know, what the main barriers of Indigenous participation in international negotiations on nature-based approaches to climate action are, such as forums like COP26 coming up. Along with states recognizing Indigenous voices, which other solutions could be fruitful for the advancement of Indigenous participation? For example, on Arctic issues affecting those communities, such as with extractivism in Greenland, what's the role of non-state actors?
Thank you. All right. So first on the main barriers for Indigenous participation when we look towards COP26. I was fortunate enough to go to the last COP that was held in Madrid, and it is so interesting to see that even though we have all these positive developments, as I mentioned, with the platform to sort of provide opportunities for Indigenous input and Indigenous knowledge into the development of policies and into the whole, the Paris Agreement and the COPs as we go forward. When it comes to the negotiations themselves, observers are not allowed in. There were a lot of sit-down demonstrations taking place from Indigenous youth just outside of the negotiation room, right in Madrid, because in spite of these things, they're not at the table. So there's still, that is a main barrier that we're seeing, not just when it comes to Indigenous peoples, but civil society at large, human rights defenders, that their voices are not, they're not allowed a vocal seat at the table. And that also is the case at the UN. There has been discussions a couple of years back. There was a process that started here in New York on how Indigenous participation could be sought beyond what we're seeing, meaning beyond the forum and the mechanisms that I mentioned in my presentation, and be more broadly. So for Indigenous representatives to be represented at the UN on all matters that affect them. And that would mean also for ECOSOC Council and for the other committees under the UN where they're not represented today. And the discussions 3 years ago landed in, obviously, without consensus. And this is because when we talk of barriers, it is a red line for many members, not many member states, but some member states, that Indigenous people self-identify. So, in terms of modalities for something like that, there's a concern of how do we regulate who and when, how does that happen? So when it comes to Indigenous representation, the self-identification part is sort of a barrier that we need to cross and need to find a good solution to. And that process will be picked up again. Actually, the discussions on participation of Indigenous peoples at the UN will be picked up at the next General Assembly. It's been postponed because of COVID, but we will have more discussions on it. And there's an Indigenous peoples coordinating body in place now to also help the targets from Indigenous peoples to hopefully go through this time. So interesting discussions, and where we seek to find solutions to some of those barriers. And I forget the other question. I'm sorry, Victoria.
The other question was, along with states recognizing Indigenous voices, which other solutions could be fruitful for the advancement of Indigenous participation? And the example given is Arctic issues affecting those communities, such as extractivism in Greenland, and the role of non-state actors in providing solutions.
Okay, so what, I'm not sure if I understand the question. So what other avenues except beyond participation?
I think so.
Okay, all right. Well, still not sure I follow. I mean, for me, obviously, from a personal perspective, I think participation is the way the way to go. Obviously, that would be the best way to ensure that we have inclusive and broad policies. I'm sorry, I'm not sure I follow.
We can also ask Sigrid to follow up with a bit more. She's not in a place she can come on right now, but I will make sure to connect you via email to get her question answered. Maybe our final question for you, because I know we are at time. Ed, do you want to come on and ask your question as the final one?
Yes. Hi, Rebecca. Great presentation. Because of your presentation, Greenland is pretty much in the top 5 of places I want to visit now. My first question is, do you see any potential objections from the Arctic 8 to the indigenous permanent participants being given the same decision-making rights that are afforded the members of the Arctic Council? Because, I mean, the way I see it is, they were there before anybody else was, so it would kind of allow them to have more of a voice. My second question, are there any real generational conflicts between the older generations and the younger generations with regards to the future of Greenland?
Rebecca, we seem to have lost your video, but maybe you are still there. Hopefully. Give her one more moment to possibly come back on and answer Ed's question, which I thought was a great question and one I am interested in knowing the answer to. I don't think you scared her off. I think your introduction saying that now Greenland is on your top places to visit, maybe she's just getting some brochures for you to come back and give you some options for traveling. I see she is coming back.
Hi, sorry. Was it just me that was thrown off, or was it everyone?
I think it was just you. I'm gonna repin you. Were you able to hear Ed's question?
I heard the first question.
Ed, do you want to come on and summarize?
Yeah, the second question just simply, is there a generational conflict between the older Greenlanders and the younger Greenlanders as far as what direction to take Greenland moving forward?
Great question, and the short answer is yes. I will start with your first question, and then I'll loop back to the intergenerational question. So on the Arctic Council and the question on whether the members of the Arctic Council would have any objections to the indigenous peoples representatives or the permanent observers to become members, as I understood you. I mean, the honest answer is yes. I think that is why we haven't seen it happen, right? There are obviously various positions in these different countries, and it spans from Denmark, who obviously has a very developed view on autonomy, and Greenland, where Greenland is represented and has a seat next to Denmark. So the Kingdom of Denmark is represented equally at the Arctic Council. But when it comes to permanent observers, there are other countries where indigenous peoples are only represented through the permanent observers and through the indigenous organizations. And I don't think in every member state case that there is an interest to expand on that. That is sort of a way to keep it at what it is, sadly. But the question is, if, as more pressure comes on this issue going forward, there has been developments over the past 20 years of the Arctic Council's while it's been in place. So hopefully we will see it develop even further. And when it comes to intergenerational conflict in Greenland, there definitely is different views in Greenland on what the future looks like. The way I see it is that the older generation have a lot more emotions connected to the issue of independence, for instance, because the trauma is not that far back. It was my mom's generation who experienced not being able to speak Greenlandic in schools, only being taught Danish. So there is some sentiments there that are strong about, wanting independence tomorrow, where I think the younger generation also wants it, but for different reasons. There's not resentment necessarily in the same way towards Denmark and the colonial past, but more a sense of, the fact that it's a different culture. We're a different country in many ways, and wanting, to move that forward. But I think the timeline that people see are very different. And for the youth, what independence look like may not be as important. It's more a fact of feeling independent and getting past the colonial traumas where the older generation really have pushed for independence much sooner, even though economically it's not viable at this point. But very personal opinions.
But very good insights too. And I know that we are over time now. So again, if everyone could please join me in giving a huge virtual round of applause. Thank you so much, Rebecca. I am so grateful that you have spent an hour on another Zoom call to share your insights and expertise. I know we are on many back-to-back Zoom calls these days, so I am so appreciative of your generosity, of your time and experiences with our participants. So thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, guys.
We are now going to move on to our second speaker, who I think will do a great job of picking up on Ed's question about some intergenerational both relationships, but maybe also differences in the Arctic. And I'm going to bring on Sam Schimmel in just a moment. Sam is going to present on food security from a firsthand perspective. He is deeply passionate about subsistence hunting and fishing from St. Lawrence Island in Alaska. He was appointed to the governor of Alaska's state climate action leadership team, and he has been doing some really amazing work both in awareness, education, and policy making around climate change, not just in the state of Alaska, but also as a representative for the National Congress of American Indians Climate Action Task Force. But I say that he is going to be a great segue into thinking about intergenerational relationships, because as our final formal speaker in the Arctic Spring College, Sam is also a youth leader. He is a young leader in Alaska, but also in the Arctic more broadly. He sits on the board of directors as the vice chair of the Arctic Youth Network. And I have had the pleasure of being on that board with him, but also on a few other virtual events. So I am very, very grateful that he has joined us today and is going to be generous with his experience, expertise, and insights. So thank you, Sam, for joining us today. And I will give the virtual floor to you.
Well, thank you, Victoria. And what a wonderful presentation by Rebecca earlier. I'm in a hotel room right now. I just got flown into Anchorage for a project that we're doing actually around food security. And so my Wi-Fi isn't that great. So if I cut out, I do apologize. but let me share my screen here. So a little bit, let me figure this out. Either way, my name is Wangaho Uyavapkayakam Simet. Hello, everybody. I'm Sam Schimmel. I'm Siberian Yupik Eskimo from Kenai, Alaska, and Gamble, Alaska. I grew up between a number of different places: Seattle, Kenai, and Gamble, all having different experiences of climate change and all having different relationships to traditional knowledge, as well as to first teachings of Native peoples. But today I'm going to be talking about Gamble. So this is where I'm from. This is a map of Alaska, and here's the Providenia Peninsula in Russia. We're out here in the middle of the Bering Sea. I keep getting a text that says I should switch this over. We're out here in the middle of the Bering Sea, about 200 miles from Nome and only about 36 miles from Russia. So we're pretty far away from the rest of the world. It seems like on our island, time moves both slower and faster. So a little bit about our community, the village of Gamble. We're a subsistence community that's over 95% Native Alaskan. Inside of the homes, our native language is spoken, our native foods are eaten, and really we rely almost exclusively on our traditional teachings to provide for our families and for ourselves. One of the realities about being so remote is that unemployment is incredibly high. More than 75, 80% of the community is unemployed. There's only a handful of jobs for this community of 800. We have a few jobs at the post office, a few at the village commissary, a few at the high school, and that's really it. And so in order to make ends meet, we rely very heavily on our traditions and our traditional knowledges. And so what does that mean? We're a sea ice people. We subsist off of the land. My uncle would always tell me growing up that we'd go down to the water's edge somewhere around over here because you watch the weather, and he would say, "Look out over the ocean." He said, "What do you see?" And I said, "I see water, I see land, I see food, and all of that." And he would laugh and he'd say, "You see our grocery store." Now I don't know where all of you guys come from here on this call. I see that there's about 35 of you that are on here right now, but I would assume that most of you live in places where there's access to a grocery store. You don't pick up a rifle and go and hunt to get meat. You don't pick up a fishing rod or a net to go get fish. You go somewhere and use a credit card at a store. In Gamble, we don't really have that luxury. We have to, if you want to eat it, if it's on your table, most likely you shot it. Most likely you caught it or you gathered it. I mean, we do have a Gamble Village store, but it is something that is really only ever relied on for essentials. One, because it's prohibitively expensive. Things like a gallon of milk will cost $14 US, whereas they may only cost 3 or 4 in somewhere like Anchorage, where I am right now. So there's a 300 or 400% markup on most of the products within the store, and it doesn't carry very much. It's hard to get shipments out there. Most of the things that it carries are really just foods that don't go bad. If any of you have been to Alaska, I'm sure you know about Pilot Bread and Crisco, the two village staples, which are one's a hard cracker that will outlive us, and the other is it's a kind of a substitute for butter. But the village store really doesn't carry much, so we rely on our ice. We rely on our traditions and our ways of knowing and ways of being in order to survive. If we didn't have, I remember one of my aunts calculated out how much it would be to have a meal of hamburgers from that store for a family of 3. And it was $333 in 2017 was how much it would cost to have just a simple meal of hamburgers from that village store. And so it's in a community where there's high unemployment, where there isn't a lot of money, you cannot rely on it. The main things that are purchased there are ammunition and fishing gear, as well as gasoline for boats. But so we rely on our sea ice. We hunt marine mammals. We hunt whales, seals, walrus, and then we fish. We catch king crabs, we catch halibut, we catch salmon, plain cod, and something that we call ugly fish. We catch all of these things, and that's what we rely on for our diet, and that's what we've relied on forever. Here you see a picture of, I believe this is one of my cousins from the early 1920s, hunting in the traditional way, which is you would go out on an ice floe and you would find a breathing hole of the walrus and you would harpoon them. And as you see here, he has his harpoon, and you bring a team of about 6 men with you and you pull that walrus up. This was the traditional way that we had hunted for thousands of years, and that we sometimes hunt still to this day. But so, as you see, our diet really hasn't changed much since time immemorial. We rely on these same foods, we eat these same things. Now, what's happening now is that this grocery store, well, for context, I guess, our sea ice is something that protects our community. I don't know if anybody here has seen any of the TV shows about the Bering Sea, but it is not a calm ocean by any means. You regularly have 30, 40, 50, even 60-foot waves that will happen during the storms in the wintertime. Couple these waves with large chunks of free-floating ice, and you end up with something the size of a school bus getting thrown 100, 200 yards up the beach. A few years back in the community of Shishmaref, their water treatment center was taken out by one of these winter storms. A chunk of ice about the size of 2 school buses got thrown into it, and it meant that the community didn't have access to water for quite some time. And so what traditionally has kept our communities safe is sea ice. We have this thing called shore-fast ice, which forms right off the beach, and it might go out a mile, it might go out 5 miles, but it goes out far enough that there serves as a buffer for any type of winter storm. Where you see even this kind of stuff. This isn't shore-fast ice, this is kind of rotten slush ice, but you see it goes out far enough that large waves aren't able to form. Ice in the water acts like land. It keeps waters low, it keeps surf low. And so it makes it so that we're able to go out and go hunting in our traditional boats and smaller boats. We don't need to be out there in a large ship, even though the waters around us might be huge. The sea ice protects us. It allows us to go out and it allows us to harvest those foods. It's also critical for animals like our walrus. Walrus feed, I think it's a depth of like 200-300 feet, but they can't stay in the water forever. They need to haul out to calf. They need to haul out to rest. They don't like sleeping in the water. And so what's happening is that as sea ice moves away from our areas, our walrus are moving, and they're moving to areas where they aren't able to find food. They're having to move to deeper water. And so that's causing starvation of animals. It's causing a lack of access to our foods. It's causing a lot of different issues. And so what's happening now is that our communities are having to adapt. We're having to change the way that we've hunted for tens of thousands of years in order to be able to just continue to survive. What this means is that rather than using traditional skin boats like this, we've transitioned to using what these are called as a lund, but aluminum boats with gas motors on them. This is because we're having to go, rather than in the past where you may have only had to go 10 or 15 miles offshore to collect walrus or to find whales, you're having to go 70 or 80 miles north to where there's sea ice that is permanent, or there's sea ice that is more present and that there's walrus on. And so we're having to change the way that we hunt. And this means that our traditional knowledges are not keeping up with these changes. In the past, our traditional knowledge of weather and of our ecosystem was able to account for and predict changes in weather systems. When we travel 80 or 90 miles away from our community, that isn't the case. As well, it becomes very dangerous when you're trying to go across open water. Remember, we're out in the middle of the Bering Sea in a 16-foot boat with 5 people in it and maybe 1,000 pounds of meat in it as well. And so what does this mean? Again, I talked a little bit about it, but this is really what climate change means for our communities. My uncle Akushki was the traditional weatherman for our community. And towards the end of his life, he would go down. We always, as I said previously, we would always go down to the beach and watch the waves, watch the weather. That's just something that you do. And we would go down with him, and he would look over at us and he'd say, the earth is faster now. The earth is moving faster now. And he didn't mean that in terms of speed. He meant that in terms of the weather is more volatile now than it was when he was younger. Storms moving quicker, they're more unpredictable. High surf happens at a moment's notice. And the buildup of traditional knowledge that has happened throughout our generations since time immemorial, those weather patterns that existed then are not the same ones that exist today. Towards the end of his life, we would always go to him before we would go out hunting or we would go out in a boat. And you'd say, Uncle, where should we go? And he would go down with you to the beach and look around and say, oh, you should go east, or you should go west, or you should go down to Southwest Cape, or you should not go out today. And towards the end of his life, he would say, I can't tell anymore. Our weather is not the same as it's been forever. And so this has, this means that today, when we used to have huge shorefast ice in March, we now have none, which means that whales blow right through our area, which means that walrus are no longer coming down to us in the south, which means that our community is susceptible to permafrost melt because it's warmer out. It means all of these different things. And so this has also had a huge impact on the nutritional and cultural well-being of our community. One of the things about our peoples is that we come together around food. We come together around food because that's where our stories come from, that's where our traditions come from, that's where our songs come from. And so when our access to food is reduced, those stories don't come out, those teachings don't come out, those practices don't come out. And so, like here, you see a typical meal. I think it's pickled or fermented herring, and then monk duck, which is whale. It looks like okuk, which is walrus, and then some beluga, as well as seal. But when we get together and gather around our food, that's where our kids and that's where our young people learn our stories and our traditions. It's when aunties are telling stories. It's when uncles are talking about hunting. And so what climate change is doing is as it is reducing that access to our traditional food, it is not only creating a nutritional deficit in the US that's filled by the USDA. So a few years back, we had poor walrus harvests in Gamble. food that we rely on incredibly heavily. And what had happened was the USDA had flown in canned Spam it's kind of like a potted meat, to address the food insecurity needs. Now, while flying in something like Spam did take care of the immediate hunger of the community, it didn't really take care of, one, the nutritional values of our community. Our food is incredibly healthy. Something like tipok, which is one of the marine animals that we gather, as I think it's 700% of your daily vitamin C in just 1 ounce of it. But these federal programs, though they address immediate hunger, they're not addressing the need for cultural connectivity, which is one of the cornerstones of mental health in the North. Where it's dark for a long time of the year, we need our communities in order to be happy and healthy. And so where we get that is from our foods. As these foods are being taken away, we're losing our traditions. We're losing not only our traditions and our mental health, but we're also losing our languages. Our language revolves around our environment. It revolves around our actions of being able to harvest and being able to take part in community gathering. As those opportunities are disappearing, so is those words, so are those teachings, which means that not only is our shoreline eroding, but our traditions are eroding. Sorry about this. And so what are we to do? What can happen? What are we going to do to preserve the standpoint that we're at and to bring back some of our traditions? I think it's also worth mentioning the economic impact of climate change in our community before we go into that piece, which is that a lot of members of our community rely on walrus ivory for carving for economic purposes. We carve ivory and we can sell it to tourists. It's completely legal in the US. And it's something that we've done for a long time. As we don't get walrus, we're not getting that capital injection into our communities, which is further causing the suffering of our peoples. But so what are we going to do about this lack of ice that is causing all of these different problems? You see here kind of where these where the freezing zones are. It's very quickly receding up the coast and heading further north. As you guys know, for the first time ever, the North Pole had open leads. I think it was last year. You were able to take a ship that wasn't an icebreaker through the north. And so what are we going to do in order to preserve the cultures and the communities of the people, the first people of the North, in the face of climate change? Where we are, it's not really a question of stopping climate change. It's more of a question of adapting to it. How do we, one, continue to exist, and how do we, two, ensure that in this next stage of development, our people have a stake? These are the main questions that many of our communities are contemplating. And so what's happening now is that our community is coming together around our young people. We're bringing traditions into the classroom and into the schools. One of the things that was a huge cornerstone of the Walker administration here in Alaska was ensuring that Native language teachers didn't need higher educational degrees in order to teach in a classroom, under the idea that it's frankly ridiculous to need a degree to teach your first language. And so we're finding ways to bring traditions into schools where, as those traditions may have come out naturally in the past, we're needing to create environments for that to happen. Things like Atok. I wonder if this video will play. But we've been bringing in our elders to teach our young people about our traditions and about our songs and dances. And we've been supplying our community members with our traditional foods. One of the most recent projects that I've been working on is this thing called Operation Fish Drop, which was a kind of a grassroots program that brought 12,000 pounds of frozen sockeye to Native elders, families, and community members in need. This was kind of a response to both COVID and to the realities of changing climates impacting both travel home and then also the ability for community members to harvest their traditional foods. And we got a range of responses to this, but I think when it comes down to intergenerational knowledge being shared through foods and the important role that food security plays, we can listen to one of our elders. Were you guys able to hear that last piece? I'll share sound. Okay. Here, listen up.
We're not holding up.
We've been, us people, been eating fish all our lives, and we are very, very thankful for your distribution, and may God bless each and every one of you volunteers. Kuyana, I was born in Hooper Bay. I'm 83 years old. Kuyana.
Well, thank you.
Oh, this is so amazing because we didn't get to go home to go fishing this summer because of the pandemic, and to get this amount of fish is such a blessing. I'm just happy. I almost want to cry. Thank you. Thank you very much.
I really appreciate this program because I know a lot of families didn't get out and subsistence fish last year with us trying to stay in our own communities due to COVID. And we really appreciate it. We didn't have any salmon in our freezer left. Thank you very much.
Thumbs up. Thank you very much.
Kuyana.
I am really glad and very pleased with this Operation Fish Drop. It's helping my family a lot and a lot of others here in Anchorage who can't get the subsistence food that they need. And I am so grateful for the people who are supplying it and the local agencies and all the people who are involved. Guyana!
And thank you so much for providing the fish. We are not living in Norvik this year, where I'm from, and it's been extremely hard to get native food here. So I appreciate everyone's effort to provide fish to the native families in Anchorage. Kuyana.
Thank you. I'm very thankful for this fish right here. It's going to help feed my family, going to feed my grandchildren. I'm going to share it with some friends because that's what we do in our culture. And it's almost Easter time. And it's been a long winter with no fish.
And so that's really what is one of the biggest dangers of climate change. We do see eroding coastlines, we do see changed environments. But one of the things that is often forgotten is the casualties of our traditions and our cultural knowledge. Erosion isn't only something that's happening on the land, it's also happening on our people. And so in moving forward and addressing the issue, it's important to make sure that we preserve and allow our communities to thrive. That means finding new ways to harvest our traditional foods. That might mean no longer using traditional skin boats and moving to aluminum boats. That might mean using rifles instead of harpoons, or that might mean using electric motors instead of gas ones. But finding ways to adapt. In our native communities, we have something that I talk about as the traditional expectation of excellence. And so our communities are working and hard to continue to exist. But that cannot happen without the support of outside entities. But it's important that that support come in the form of an ask of what can we do to help. The top-down integration of policy rarely works, especially on traditional communities. And so in all of your work, I ask you to reach out to Native communities that you work with or that you're thinking about working with, and ask them the simple question of how can we help? What do you need? And you will probably get a very simple answer of what actually needs to happen. So with that, I saw that there were some questions in the chat, or Victoria, if you wanted to say anything.
Yeah.
That's my presentation.
Well, before we get to questions, I just want to ask everyone to join me in giving a huge virtual round of applause. Thank you, Sam, so much for being so open, so thoughtful, and sharing so much context to, I think, what many here have read about or learned about, but don't quite have the grounding that you were able to provide. So thank you so much. We do have a few questions that have come in. Again, if you have questions for Sam, please put those in the chat because we have about 25 minutes left for some robust discussion. I'm going to ask KK if you would like to come on and ask your question first about food security.
Hello, Samuel. I posed this question to our last speaker, Rebecca, but it is much more pointed to you. This is kind of an emotional subject for me, so I hope that I can keep the emotion out of it. And especially after your video, that's kind of made me feel a little bit of emotion. When thinking of food security, this is a bit more dry, but when thinking of food security and traditional practices, the response time has been sluggish and non-responsive to the changes in wildlife populations and migrations that directly affect your communities. And your mention of, Rebecca had made a mention of the unregulated high sea fisheries in the Arctic Ocean Agreement. It's a proactive approach as far as policy goes, but that area is yet inaccessible and doesn't necessarily address the current day climate change food security issues. What would you like to see happen as far as speeding this migration process, this mitigation process? For instance, the exchange rate between the scientists and the policymaker. Now, I know that that in itself is not, that sentence in itself is not inclusive, but when I say policymaker, I mean the indigenous community as well. So, and I guess I would have posed that question just a little differently, as she was speaking for the UN and so forth. So how I know you're working on your things in your community and traditional knowledge and how that transfers, but if you could put a fire under the seat, what would you say would be the most important thing for speeding the mitigation process between the exchange between science and the policymaker, so that you can see some results?
Okay. To, I guess, your early point there, we do see illegal fishing in violation of UNCLOS on the part of Korean fishing vessels right off of our coast, actually in U.S. territorial waters, but the Coast Guard's quite far away from us, and so they rarely ever get made contact with. In terms of increasing the dialogue and the fast action between traditional knowledge holders and policymakers, ensuring that tribal nations have the autonomy to create their own hunting and fishing regulations is critical to ensuring that we're able to adapt to changing migration patterns. In terms of marine mammals, we're given broad leeway on when we're allowed to hunt. But in terms of things like ducks and geese, we're given a much more narrow scope. For instance, our snow geese come earlier and earlier every year now. Whereas they may have come previously in October or in September, they're now coming in August, which means that the federal season for snow geese isn't open. Alaska is good on ensuring that they have, I believe it's called snap openers, but the state will issue emergency open orders on subsistence hunting for certain species, depending on the one, need of the community, and then two, the need for the need of the status of migration. But I think really to talk about what's needed in order to see real adaptation that allows for the continuance of life. One of the programs that I've been working on with Senator Murkowski is to change the way that subsidies are given in Alaska. Right now, we get food stamps, we get food aid, we get a lot of different things, but none of them really address the cultural need that are presented. The aid that we're getting isn't helping us to adapt to the changing weather patterns, to the changing climate, and get our traditional foods. So finding ways that aid can help us get access to our own foods. Now that looks like subsidizing ammunition, subsidizing gasoline, ensuring that Native communities have the first right of refusal to Army surplus boats, things like that. I think programs that are built around providing access to our traditional foods are far more valuable than ones that are just a quick fix or a band-aid on the issues of a food insecurity that is not temporary. The food insecurities that are arising in the Arctic right now for traditional communities, they aren't temporary. They're systemic. They're going to become more and more long-term as we see more and more changes to the climate. And so finding ways that our communities can continue to practice our traditions is critical. And that means directing federal dollars and directing funding towards programs that can do that.
Thank you.
I have so many more questions. I'm hoping I can contact you via email.
Yeah, I'll throw it in the chat.
Great. And we may have time, KK, for you to come back on and ask one or two of those questions. But first, I'm going to ask Samuel if you would like to come on and ask your question next.
Yeah, thank you for a really great talk. I was just wondering if you can foresee or if there are currently any noticeable tensions among communities as they, as you say, adapt between retaining traditional ways of life, but also the impacts of sort of outside developments as the ice continues to melt, like in terms of jobs or infrastructure, and if there's any sort of tensions there.
Well, there's always, for Native peoples in Alaska, we've always had those contentions. We're oil and gas producers. Some of the larger oil and gas producers in the state are Native. ASRC, Doyon, both regional Native corporations that hold oil and gas leases, operate the Alyeska pipeline, and then also sell oil and gas, really. And so that type of duality isn't something that's new for us. There is a realization and a need for the growth of an economy in a lot of communities. And that is balanced and tempered by our traditions and our ability to conserve our areas. But they're not mutually exclusive. You don't choose economic development or traditional knowledge. It's a balance of, it's not even a balance of the two, it's figuring out how you can integrate both into one thing. And so when it comes to discussions of things like shipping in the Arctic, you saw a large number of Alaska Native leaders work with the Obama administration to implement something that was referred to as the Bering Sea Bering Sea Climate Resiliency Order, which protected areas around whaling communities in Alaska. So it put, I think it was like a 12-mile buffer around us, Whale, Shishmaref, Point Hope, Barrow, except for it's pretty shallow up there. They don't really get very much shipping. But you see this, it's nothing new for us to balance the need for economic growth with our traditional knowledges. I think if you're looking for a good example of how that's done, Sealaska is doing an amazing job of that in Southeast, as with Bristol Bay, actually, Bristol Bay Native Corporation. And so we live in a world where we have one foot in our traditions and one in the reality of the U.S., which is that if you want to be able to provide for your people, you need to be able to make money. And in order to make money, you have to engage in economic activity. For a lot of communities, that means resource extraction, or that means access, or that means other pieces. And so it's really up to each community to decide how they want to find that balance and how they want to do those things. And I think it's not helpful for outside groups to try and place weight on the scales of that decision. That should really rely with the community.
Thank you. So we have another question from Jeffrey, who wants to know if you can speak a bit more about the Arctic Youth Network and anything else you might want to share about Operation Fish Drop.
Thanks, Victoria. I just wanted to butt in here. Sorry about that. Sam, it's Jeffrey here, and I just wanted to thank you because the work you're doing with Arctic Youth Network is phenomenal work. It's incredibly important work. And I also imagine it's very hard work. So on behalf of somebody who follows the Arctic Youth Network Instagram page and keeps up with the work you guys are doing, this is a serious thank you and appreciation. Thank you.
Well, thank you for being engaged and for being a part of the network. In terms of, for those who don't know what the AYN is, it's, I guess in my mind, the best way of describing it would be kind of a clearinghouse for organizing around issues in the Arctic. We're Arctic-centric, but not Arctic parochial, in the sense that we have members from non-Arctic areas. We have members from southern Canada. We have people from different parts of the U.S. from, I think the final number was 18 different time zones. But really what it is a organization that is dedicated to building advocacy capacity for peoples living in the Arctic or people interested in the Arctic. We don't push any particular point of view or anything like that. We're simply here to help build capacity for organizing around Arctic issues. This means holding webinars. This means connecting communities to resources. This means really being I guess a jack of all trades when it comes to, one, finding resources, two, making sure that people have access to them, and then three, connecting people. And so if you haven't checked us out, I will put the link in the chat, and I would ask all of you to do that. And if you know any young people that that are interested in becoming involved, refer them to the website and to our global team. We're always looking to engage more people and to help uplift voices. In terms of Operation Fish Drop, so the Arctic Youth Network has its fingers in a lot of different pies. One of those things is Operation Fish Drop, which is actually why I'm here in Anchorage today. But OFD is something that I was able to put together that tries to address food insecurities of the urban Native population in the Anchorage area. Those disparities were exacerbated by COVID. Community members weren't able to go back to their hometowns. They weren't able to go back to their traditional sites. They weren't able to go home this summer because of COVID lockdowns. Alaska, I think somebody talked about it earlier, but some communities in Alaska saw COVID infection rates north of 60%. Places like Akiak saw COVID infection rates north of 60%. And so in order to protect our communities, we went into lockdown. We didn't allow anybody back. Like I wasn't able to go home to gamble this summer because our community was in lockdown. And so in order to address the food security needs that were brought forth by this inability to go home and harvest, we were able to bring together 12,000 pounds of sockeye salmon, which is one of the traditional foods that we rely heavily on, and give that out in 25-pound boxes to over 500 families, elders, and community members, serving a total population of, I think, around 1,800 individuals. And that video that you saw was some of our elders talking about what that means. I think one of the most poignant points that was made by our elders was there was a lady from, I think, Non-Dalton, who came in and said, you know, I'm finally going to be able to feed my grandchildren fish. That's all they've been asking for, and we didn't have any this summer because we weren't able to go home. And so really that's what Operation Fish Drop is. We're trying to build that into a program right now, but that requires funding. If anybody here is well connected to funders or anything like that, please let me know. We're always looking to grow and build programs. So that's a little bit about the AYN and also Operation Fish Drop.
Thanks, Sam.
Yeah, thank you. And I will share both of those links in our follow-up email too, in case you aren't copying and pasting from our chat, so you will not miss anything. We have just under 10 minutes left, so I'm going to ask KK if you want to come back on and ask a final question.
Hello again, Sam. How much does the maritime traffic, to include the upswing in the fishing vessels, because I know that's happening, affect the more recent years with the wildlife patterns? It may be, as you said, with your uncle's weather reports, unpredictable and difficult to read. But do you notice, first of all, an increase in the traffic, like visibly noticeable, and do you connect that to changes in any of their patterns?
I mean, at present, there isn't really any commercial shipping going on through the Northwest Passage, which would be the shipping route that we'd be on. Nobody's really going up and over on a commercial scale right now. In terms of fishing vessels, over the past 10 years, you've seen an increase in Japanese, Korean, and Chinese fishing vessels coming into very close proximity to our waters. And sometimes actually into the 6-mile buffer that we have around our island. But what does that mean for us? It means that the marine mammals that we eat often are scarred if there's been fishing vessels in the area. You see a decline in the seal population, or you see them be a lot more wary, or you see them and they might have net scars on them. On a seal, a net scar it looks like this. It's just a patch with no hair on it. You see a reality that the If you go out fishing, the fishing's not as good. But in terms of increased traffic, we haven't really seen a huge increase in traffic. I think as time progresses and as the as there's less and less permanent sea ice in the Arctic, and that shipping route becomes commercially viable, we're going to see a huge increase in that. Where we are is right between the US and Russia. We're right on that little barrier. So it's yet to be seen whether or not they will navigate through US waters and go behind us, or stay in international waters and go in front of us. I hope that they go behind us, because that'll put a larger buffer around our island. But that is one of the major concerns. When I sat on the climate action leadership team for Governor Walker, that was one of the main sections of our proposal, which was how do we figure out, one, how to ensure that Native communities have access to capital generated through shipping. Two, how do we ensure regulation of shipping and ensure that compliance? How do we make sure that heavy fuel oil isn't getting leaked into the Arctic if a ship does capsize or crash? And how do we ensure that our Native communities' hunting and fishing is protected while this economic development is allowed to happen? And so I think those are all still huge questions. And they're not really questions that can be put off tomorrow. We need to figure out these solutions today, figure out how we can regulate these groups, because quite frankly, I think that if we do not, or we're not somewhat competitive, the international community will use the Russian waters. Russia has a poor record of kind of environmental regulation. I hope there's no Russians on here, but we need to be somewhat competitive on the international sphere, so that way we can kind of control what happens around our communities. So, I mean, yeah, we will see a huge increase in traffic, but we haven't seen that yet.
Yeah, thank you. I am also hearing something that could be explored further by anyone on this call, thinking about future-oriented challenges, paired perhaps with Sam's earlier call to reach out to communities and ask what's needed, and not to do research or projects that are centered on, Southerners and Southern perspectives, but also be engaging with what is needed at a community level. And with that, we are at our time. So again, thank you, Sam, so much for spending an hour with us today, sharing your story, your expertise, your experiences, and doing all of that from an Anchorage hotel room. So thank you for being with us today. I am sure I speak for everyone on our call that it is incredibly appreciated. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And I hope you guys all stay safe and stay well.
Thank you, Sam. So, again,